In the first video, we explored the reasons behind choosing a closed board style of fence, and I installed the posts and rails. In this video, I'll be building the structure of the gates, but first I need to install the gate posts. The single gate at the far end of the garden is where my fence meets my neighbours. There's an existing post on the boundary, but it's not tall enough for my gate, and because I'll need to do another fence along this boundary at some point, I can't have my hinges attached to the existing post as they'll be in the way. So I'm attaching a new post to the existing one, as the footings for the existing post means I can't concrete in the new one. I offset the fence slightly to allow room for a feather edge pale, which will hide the post when the fence is finished, and bored 3 holes with a spade bit deep enough for coach screws to attach to a good depth in the existing post. The larger gate is on its last legs, and I want to replace it with much taller double gates, which means I need bigger posts than the 4x4 ones I've used so far. The post on the right is 175 by 175 millimeters, so I bought a matching post 2.4 meters in length. My gates will be around the same height as the rest of the fence at 2 meters, so ideally the post would be 2 meters above ground as well, but to achieve that I'd have needed to go up to a 3 meter length post, which was another £30, so I'll need to figure out how to make the gates so the hinges can attach lower down. I broke up the concrete around the existing left side post and dug a super wide hole. The post will be 1.8 metres out of the ground, so following the same rule as in the last video, a third of that is 60 centimetres, which needs to be below ground. So together that's the 2.4 metre length. I used a string line to orientate it to match the right post and then concreted it in the same way I showed in the last video. The right post, while being the right width, isn't tall enough, but instead of breaking up the concrete, pulling it out, disposing of it and buying a new one, I'm going on a mission to save it and increase its height. I removed the old gate hinges and cleaned up the post with a jet washer. I then cut the pointed top off the post and was pleased to see there was no rot on the inside. The outside face does have a big split all the way down, but I'm pretty sure these posts are made of oak, unlike the 4x4s, and oak does have a tendency to split while still being structurally sound. Anyway, this side will be covered with fencing pales later on, so the split won't be seen. So how am I going to increase the height of the post? Well, I found this old section in the garden which has a similar split on it, so maybe it was part of the same post at some point. I cut through, and again the inside looked in decent condition, so I cut off a section of the standing post and then made a mirror cut on the other one. I didn't film this, but I took my circular saw to the left post and set the angle against the pointy triangle at the top so I could replicate the same shape. I treated the whole thing with wood preserver as it had been lying on the ground for ages, and then used some exterior rated wood glue to secure it in place, and attached through the post using some long screws I had. If I were a better woodworker, I'd have probably used an oak dowel to help bind the two together, but it seemed strong enough as it was. I then mixed some glue and sawdust to fill any gaps. Mission accomplished, at least for now. Right, let's make some gates. I'm starting with a single out-of-sight gate at the back, so any mistakes I make I can learn from for the double gates. I'm using treated 2x4 C24 strength Carcassing timber for the structure. I worked out what height I wanted the gate so it would match the top of the fence and then factored in a 5cm gap underneath. I cut the timbers to length and laid them out so I could see the basic structure of the gate. To attach it all together, I could screw through the sides of the vertical timber to attach the horizontal pieces, but far stronger will be to create a proper joint, and the half flats seemed like the best choice for this. So to do this, I'm going to use my other mitre saw, the Evolution R255, which I got a year or so ago when Evolution kindly reached out to me and asked if I'd like a free one, no obligations, and of course I said yes, and I've been putting it through its paces since. So I took an offcut to mark out the width of the joint and set the depth stop so the blade comes down to the halfway point. I could then make a series of cuts. Because the blade isn't going all the way down, the lowest point of the blade doesn't reach the mitre saw fence, so you either have to turn the piece around and make another series of cuts on the other side, or you can use a sacrificial piece behind the timber. I could then hammer out the ridges, and then to smooth the surface you can use a chisel, or if you're confident, the mitre saw again by sliding the timber back and forth. Really, you should use a mitre saw stand to steady the timber, but I just made sure I was very conscious of what I was doing, where my hands were, and I wasn't taking more than a couple of millimeters off. I do want to stress that you shouldn't necessarily copy me. A sharp chisel will work just as well, I just didn't have my set with me at the time. So yeah, I really like this mitre saw. I still use my Parkside one, which you've seen me use a bunch, and I really can't fault it. It's an excellent machine, and it's often my go-to saw for simple cuts, mainly because, as I don't have my workshop set up yet, it's lighter to carry outside. Unfortunately, Lidl only sell it at certain times of the year. The Evolution is a much more capable saw, but it's probably more capacity than I need. It'll be a rare occasion that I'd need to cut an 80mm depth, so I think, in my non-expert opinion, the R210, which cuts up to 65mm, is the way to go if you're in the market for one in the low to mid price range. So I got back in touch with Evolution recently, and they very generously sent me one to give away. It's the SMS Plus version, which comes with a few more accessories, so if you want to win, just comment below with Evo MS. It's a 3-pin plug, so it's only open to those in the UK and Ireland. So once my half laps were cut, I did a dry fit to make sure everything was okay, and moved over to the more level patio area for the glue up. I'm using this Evo Stick weatherproof wood glue. I'm sure there must be cheaper alternatives, so do let me know if you have any recommendations. I'm just using my fingers to apply it as it's quite satisfying to peel off once dry. I didn't read the instructions initially, but it does say to just apply on one side, not both. Oops. I made sure the corners were completely square, and then I used 40mm screws in a square pattern to secure the joints. So I've got my basic gate structure now, but if I were to leave it like this, over time it will sag, like this. So it needs to be braced. There's a bunch of different methods of bracing a gate, but 99% of the time, the best option is a compression brace, which runs from the top of the latch side to the bottom of the hinge side. There's another rule to follow, which is that the ideal angle for the brace is 45 degrees or steeper. So take these gates I bought and installed a few years ago, for example. The braces aren't steep enough. They've been fine, but if we can do better, we should. To work this out, there's no need for a protractor. If the width is equal to or less than the height, then you're fine. But if the width is greater, there are a few things you can do. You can move the brace into this position to make it steeper, or if that's not enough, you can cut the middle timber so the brace goes from the top all the way down to the bottom. Another option is to change the location of the horizontal timbers, or if you have a really wide gate, you can have the braces run in parallel. So mine did need adjusting, but only by moving into this position. They're a bit tricky to attach, so I'm relying on a very tight fit, which is important for a compression brace anyway, a spot of wood glue, which won't be as effective on the end grain, and then one 150mm screw into the horizontal timbers. So here it is attached. Obviously this is once the pails are on. I found some proper gate hinges, but I'd made a rookie mistake. I'd already cut my post and it's shorter than the top horizontal timber, so I had to put another horizontal timber in for the top hinge. I'm sure I'll be fine, but lesson learnt for the double gates. To work out the width of each gate, I measured the distance between the posts, divided by 2, and then deducted another 5 or 10mm for a small gap between the gates. I'll jump forward so we can look at how I designed them. Because I learnt from the issue with the other gate, and that my posts are only 1.8 metres high, the top hinge rail is lower down. Because I'll be attaching a capping rail to the top, I need something to secure it to, so I used a counter rail here, which I'll be adding to the rest of the fence in the next video. The bottom hinge is higher up this time, to allow for space for the lower side of the hinge to attach to the post. You don't want this to be too high up, otherwise the bottom of the pails become flimsy and it'll be easy to put your foot through them. The vertical timbers do go all the way down though, as I may want to add a monkey tail bolt, great name, at some point. So following the rules for bracing, this time mine runs from the top all the way down to the bottom, and the middle rail is not half lapped in as it's not structural. It's mainly there to steady the brace and to act as something to nail the pails to in the middle. I made the gates in the same way. The only difference was that I cut a rebate rather than a half lap for the counter rail at the top. The hinges were another garage find. These are quite heavy gates and the holes in the hinges are pretty wide, so I bought some 8mm wide, 40mm long coach screws to attach them to the gates and the post, pre-drilling them first. I used a level 2x4 to sit the gates on while attaching, and here's the finished article. There are a couple of things I want to point out. You can see here that all the screws and all the marks on the timbers face the outside of the gate, as this will be hidden by the pails. The inner, visible side looks a lot cleaner, so you need to think about this when you're cutting your half laps. The other point is how close you attach the gate to the post will depend on how well orientated your posts are to each other. Let me explain. Ideally, your posts would be totally square with each other. If this is the case, then the side of each of the gates can be touching the posts, and they'll meet square in the middle. However, if one or both of your posts faces slightly towards the inner side of the gate, and you butt the gates to the post, then they won't be able to meet flat in the middle. So to deal with this, you need to leave a little gap between the posts and the gate to allow them to swing forward a little and be able to meet. Kind of hard to explain, but hopefully that makes sense. So I was super happy with how these turned out. The tops of the two gates are perfectly level and the gap between them is really consistent. But was the install a smooth process? Unfortunately not. The new post I put in was exactly plumb, but the existing post that I saved, I just never checked, which was daft. It turns out it was leaning inwards towards the centre of the gates and outwards towards the woodland. To resolve the first issue, I had to cut a slice in the shape of a furring strip from the side of the gate, and the second issue, I packed out the top hinge. I guess a sign of a good DIYer is solving challenges, but a great DIYer probably doesn't create them in the first place. Oh, here's the lady of the house. What do you think, love?
Oh wow, you fixed it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
There was a problem, but yeah.
Oh my god, it looks so good. Symmetrical.
Alright, that's a wrap for this one. In the final video, I'll be installing the feather edge pails and getting acquainted with a nail gun for the first time. See you then.